Greetings and salutations, and thank you for clicking on the video. Today I'm going to attempt to answer a question that I get all the time, and that is, what is the best Linux distro? What's the best Linux distro to start out on if you're a new user? I have been asked this question over and over and over again since I started posting videos about Linux on YouTube, and usually the answer depends on a lot of different things. And I don't ordinarily just throw something out there. I usually ask the person, well, what do you want to do with your computer? How much do you know about computers? That sort of thing. But these days, as of like the last 6 weeks, my answer is short and sweet and to the point. The best distribution of Linux for new users and experienced users alike is Ubuntu Mate 16.04 LTS. Absolutely, no question about it. This is the best Linux experience that I personally have ever had in the 10 years that I have been playing around with Linux. And I have already done several installs through Easy Linux, at least 5. And this is when it was in beta, before it was even officially released. And every one of those clients is just absolutely unbelievably happy. And it works really, really well. So that's the answer to that question. What is the best Linux distro? Well, it's Ubuntu Mate 16.04. No doubt about it. Don't use anything else. You'll never need another distribution of Linux. That's it. Done with the video. Talk to y'all later. No, actually, I'm not done. We're going to ramble on for a bit here on this subject. I guess it's been about a year ago that I posted a video called What's the Best Linux Distro? And that's been a very popular video on my channel for lots of reasons. And at that point in time, I made a very politically correct sort of video. I did talk a great deal about the flaming in the community. I'm not going to get into that here. But I was trying to talk about, what is the best video for, the best distribution for new users, and here's what I thought, and this is the experience that I had. So I wanted to update that video because it is quite old, and I do really like Ubuntu Mate. So I wanted to have a video that included that. So yesterday, I spent 2.5 hours working on this video. I even wrote up this presentation for the screen that had all this stuff on it, and I put together what I thought was a very nice, politically correct, objective video, trying not to step on anybody's toes, trying to make everything, acceptable to all facets of the Linux community. Because every time that something comes out of my mouth, I realize that the Linux community in general is going to pick it apart. And I need to be careful about what I say. And anyway, I completed this video, uploaded it to YouTube, and then I played the video back and I realized that I had misspelled the word distribution in the presentation, in the title of the presentation. So the first thing that you saw the video there was this big misspelled distribution, and I really trashed it. It was like DISSTROBUE something. Oh, horrible. Dyslexia kicked in or something, and through all of the editing and moving everything around, I didn't catch it. And I just started laughing because I said to myself, why would anybody believe anything that you have to say if you can't spell the word distribution properly? So I took the video down, and I just laughed about it. I didn't really get upset because stuff like that happens, And I said, well, I'll just take another swing at it later. Well, last night I ended up doing something kind of interesting after dinner. Everybody kind of went off and did their own thing, and I decided, since I had some time and there really wasn't anything on TV worth watching, that I would do an Arch Linux install. I have been playing around with Manjaro. I have been trying to get Anargos installed, or Anagros, or however you say the name of that distribution. And it's because I want to learn more about Arch Linux. And I hadn't attempted a straight Arch Linux install in a long time. So I sat down, got me a cup of coffee. I opened up the Arch Wiki, downloaded the ISO for the Arch, the Arch distribution, and I started installing it, which meant sitting there and typing in a command line, command after command after command to configure this system. And with Arch Linux, with straight Arch, there is no automation of any kind. You set up the entire system from scratch. And so you have to, edit all the configuration files, and you have to partition the drive using command line tools. It's very, very informative. I think that if you ever want to learn how Linux works and what's going on when your computer boots up and how this is all put together, take the time to do an Arch Linux install. Go ahead, do it. And just sit down and do it and get through it and see how far you can get with it, because it will teach you what's going on with the computer. Now, I don't recommend Arch Linux for everybody out there. I think Arch Linux is for the kind of Linux user who would also be the kind of person who would go down to the auto parts store and get enough parts to build their own car. Most of us want to just pick one up off the lot and drive away with it. But if that is where your mind is and you're inclined in that direction, have at it. But anyway, it really changed my perspective on things. And when I got up this morning, I was reading a bunch of stuff, and I thought, that video you did yesterday is totally off the mark, because it's trying to be politically correct. And thinking about the whole Arch Linux install experience, thinking about bringing new people into Linux. I've been doing this now for a couple of years. Easy Linux is very cool in that I get to work with people all around the world, and I get to take people who don't know much about computers even and help them to get Linux installed. And I learned so much from the experience. So this video is coming from a lot of places, as my opinions as we roll along here. It's coming from that, and it's coming from the fact that I have been working in IT for 25 years, and I used to program automation systems for radio stations. The only reason I stayed in radio for as long as I did was not because I was a real super talented announcer. It was because I knew how to run computers, and the companies that I worked for needed somebody to maintain the systems. And it was easier to be a program director and be in charge and be in management to program the automation system. You had to have the title in order to be able to do the work. So that's how I managed to stay in radio for as long as I did. And that was an experience where I worked with people who also were not computer literate and had to teach them how to run these systems. And then I went to work for Gateway and worked in the computer lab as an accelerated support tech. And what I did was I worked on a very small team of people who dealt with folks who had major problems with their computers, and the regular support techs couldn't help them. So that's really been my experience, is not only setting up computers and working with computers, but working with people to get things done with computers or get computers fixed. So a lot of what I'm going to say comes from that, and just 10 years of experience playing around in the Linux community and watching this thing. And the first time I ever saw Linux was in the computer lab at Gateway in 1999, and it was Caldera Open Linux 1.3. So that's how far back I go with Linux. Now, I actually only started playing with Linux seriously maybe about 8 or 10 years ago. It was one of the early Ubuntus. It was like Ubuntu 7 or 8, something like that. But anyway, that's where all of this comes from. And today in this video, you've hung with me so far, and I haven't said much of importance, but it's going to be a rambling video, and there's not going to be a lot to see. This is the way it is. So what I want to do is I want to jump over here, and I want to take a look at distrowatch.com, because distrowatch.com is a clearinghouse for all of the different projects that put out distributions of Linux. And even people who don't know a lot about Linux, somehow or another they know about DistroWatch. I was reading an article about Martin Wimpress, who's the head developer for Ubuntu Mate, and he said the same thing. He said, I don't know how, but people know what DistroWatch is. And of course, DistroWatch is famous for having their rankings over here for all the different Linux distributions. They have a top 100 list, which is really just how many people have come to DistroWatch and looked at the page, but still, It's very hard to track not only how many people actually use Linux, but it's hard to know how many people use any individual distribution. So these are all the numbers we got. All of these distributions that you look at here, they represent the vision of some group of people, whether that be just a few people working together to come up with a distribution or a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They are taking a technology and putting it together in such a way to create a user experience. Linux in and of itself is not an operating system. Linux is a kernel. And all the kernel does, it's a computer program that tells the hardware on the computer what to do. It takes the input from the user and takes the input from the programs that are running on it and makes the machine do something useful. That's all a kernel does. It just manages hardware and memory and things like that. So when we call Linux an operating system, it's really a misnomer because it's not. It's just a kernel. But these distributions, they take all of these different pieces of software and they put them all together, and it becomes a computing experience that does everything you need it to do. I was thinking about that last night while I was installing Arch. It was like, it's all these little bits and pieces, and the install process ties them together. You know, you put in the bootloader, and then you put in the display manager so that when the system boots and you set up the initialization system. Blech, I can say that, can you? And it's all this stuff, and you have to configure it one after the other, all these little bits and pieces, and that's what this is. So people come here and they read about all these different distributions, and each one of these distributions represents a vision that somebody has for a certain set of users. And many distributions of Linux say, well, it's new user friendly, it's easy to use. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true, because it's all about perspective. It's about who's going to use this and who's developing it. And there is a great quote from Steve Jobs from many years ago that he said, take the user experience and work their way back. You know, just putting out a piece of technology because it's really cool technology and all the nerds like it doesn't mean that it's relevant, and it doesn't mean that it is something that average people on the street are going to get something out of. And it's like art for art's sake. Okay, a lot of people in the Linux community that I hear talk, they go on and on about how this is done and the political correctness of the code and whether it's proprietary and open source. Average users do not care about that sort of thing. They are not computer nerds. They're not computer science majors. They're just people trying to get things done. So a lot of these distributions that are listed come from this kind of semi-elitist attitude of, well, we're going to do it better than everybody else. I mean, we're going to do it perfectly. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's useful. That's what they're going to do. So, I want to go through some of these distributions, and I want to talk about the good things and the bad things. I want to look at their distro watch page, and we're going to talk about distributions that we've talked about a lot here on this channel, and distributions that are examples of some of the negatives and positives that I want to talk about. So the first one I want to talk about is Ubuntu, which is the granddaddy of them all these days. I know Debian is older, and I know that Red Hat's been around longer, but Ubuntu hit the scene more than 10 years ago now and promised to be Linux for human beings. And it has been. It has revolutionized Linux on the desktop. But Ubuntu has problems, and to tell you the truth, I'm a little bit disappointed with this latest version of Ubuntu, the Ubuntu 16.04 LTS. The first thing that I don't like about it is the fact that they really have not done anything to make the system new user friendly or more user friendly since Ubuntu 12.04. When you install Ubuntu and boot it up for the first time, you are presented with a blank desktop. There is nothing there. Oh, well, that's not necessarily true. We get a list of shortcuts for the Unity desktop the first time it's booted up. That's the first thing you see. Big whooping deal. Like anybody's going to be able to remember the 150 shortcuts that are listed on that page. And this is their welcome screen. Here are 150 shortcuts for the Unity desktop that you need to memorize. And I really don't even know how to get that thing back if I need it. But that's not the point. There's nothing about this system that has changed significantly in 4 years. There's a lot of it's changed under the hood. There's been a lot of really cool technological advances in Ubuntu. But the Unity desktop experience, it's exactly the same as it's always been. And while I do not hate Unity, and I have written articles and praised Unity for certain things, there are things about it that I don't like. It is very confining. It is hard to configure. They just recently in Ubuntu 16.04 gave you an option to move the launcher bar to the bottom. That should have been there when Unity came out in Ubuntu 11.04, and it wasn't. And it's this concept, and I think GNOME 3 started this. Somebody started this a few years ago of let's take settings away. Let's try and make this as simple as possible. And in the process of doing that, they have come up with something that seems to be very rigid. And Unity, while it was a reaction to GNOME 3 and tried to simplify the GNOME 3 experience or whatever their original intent was. Actually, the original intent was to have a desktop that worked on mobile systems and desktops at the same time. Because, Ubuntu is all about this convergence thing. Let's get it to run on phones. Let's get it to run on tablets. Let's get it to run on your toaster. We want Ubuntu everywhere, and we want the same experience. But the Unity 7 desktop has not changed. And the other thing about Ubuntu 16.04 that I found a little bit disappointing was it was working great in beta, and then when they released the official release, now there are all kinds of problems. The new GNOME software application they've gone to doesn't work all that well, and there's problems getting some software included. There are packages that we had in Ubuntu 14.04 that aren't here. They've made some changes, and there's some instability to the system that for a desktop user, not somebody who would use it in a server. So therefore, I'm kind of about Ubuntu. I have recommended it in the past for people who run laptops, and I've certainly set up Ubuntu for a lot of folks. But that was 14.04, and this is 16.04, and I think things have moved on big time as far as desktop technology is concerned. So that is my opinion currently of Ubuntu, the standard desktop with the Unity experience. Ubuntu Gnome. I just did a couple of videos about Ubuntu Gnome and actually had it installed and running up on hardware for a while, and I'm really glad that I did the hard drive swap to do that, because this only ran for 2 or 3 days before I went back to Ubuntu Mate. And the reasons why were just a very inconsistent and very sluggish desktop experience. The Ubuntu Gnome desktop, it sucks up a lot of resources, and on my hardware, which is, it's not the world's greatest, certainly, but it's not the world's worst either. It was really sluggish and draggy a lot of times. It would have a problem. But that really wasn't the reason why I stopped using it. It was because of the inconsistencies in the way it ran. It's like the GNOME applications looked beautiful on the screen, but then I opened up VLC, and on the monitor that I was using, the fonts, I had scaled them up to make them easier to see. But then that font scaling did not apply to many of the applications that I ran. And exactly what that is, whether it's an incompatibility or just a GTK3 problem or something like that, or I had no idea. But it was really disappointing after a while. And I just said, you know what? Forget it. And I took the hard drive out and put the other one back in and went back to Ubuntu Mate. And I think that's how I'm going to do hardware installs from this point forward. If I'm going to test something in hardware, I'm not going to actually reload the system. One of my viewers actually suggested that and said, why don't you just put another hard drive in there? And he was absolutely right. So I dug up a hard drive, and that's how I did it. So yeah, the Ubuntu Gnome experience, even for a more advanced Linux user, because it's very minimalist and somebody who digs the whole GNOME 3 concept, it didn't work out for me. Don't know how the GNOME desktop works on other distributions. I don't play around with it much, but Ubuntu Gnome, And I think the main thing I wanted to say before I move on from this particular paradigm, this GNOME paradigm, which is used by a lot of distributions. I mean, you're going to find it on Fedora and Arch Linux and things like that. I think GNOME, I think they're honestly barking up the wrong tree. I think their user experience is so, you got to do it the GNOME way, even with all the extensions, and it's very inflexible, and it's even more inflexible than the Unity desktop. And after a while, even though I think it's a really cool idea, and it's very cool looking, and it's very shiny, and ooh, this is neat, and it's got these, when you actually start using it for a while, it starts to grate on you. And each time that I am sucked into using GNOME, when I get done using GNOME, I'm always like, yeah, I'm kind of glad not to be having to deal with that. That's my take on it. The next distribution I want to talk about a little bit is Linux Mint. And Linux Mint is a distribution which I do love, and I still love, and always will, I guess, because Linux Mint made Ubuntu pleasant for me when I was first starting to really get into it. I played around with Ubuntu for a while, and then I loaded Linux Mint, and I thought, oh, you guys are great. They try and give you an experience right out of the box that is ready to go. So back in the old days of Ubuntu, it used to be really difficult to install codecs to play videos and things like that. This was a problem. So Linux Mint, they made it so that when you installed it, it was just there, and that's awesome. And Linux Mint is still a great distribution, and for certain people who are a particular kind of computer user, I think it's very appropriate. And those people would be somebody who is not necessarily a total computer nerd, but they have an idea of what they want from their computer experience. They're a little bit more sophisticated. They understand what a desktop is. They want something that is very configurable, but only to a certain point. And Linux Mint gives you that, because what it does is when you install it, you get this set of applications that pretty much do all the basic things. You get all of the codecs installed, and you don't really have to mess with it. It's very elegant. It's very polished. I'm very much looking forward to Linux Mint 18 coming along. But the downside to Linux Mint is that if that user experience that they provide you is not going to work for you, and you start trying to go outside of the system or change things, it gets a little weird. Mint can be incompatible with certain things. It's hard to, sometimes it's hard to work the system. Also, the Mint project is very conservative about updates. They will not update the kernel automatically, for instance, and certain packages they hold back. They do that for stability's sake. But in today's modern age, when security is becoming more and more of a concern, even on the Linux operating system, I really think that not having a way to dynamically update that kernel is, or automatically do it, is not a good idea. I think that, and you know, it's like if you're running Linux Mint 17 right now, and you've upgraded it from 17.1 to 17.2 to 17.3, and you've never changed the kernel, you're still on kernel 3.13, which is like, at this point in time, that's really old. That is a 3-year-old kernel, and there have been many security patches that have been done since then. So Ubuntu upgrades the kernel. They maintain their own kernel. And so if they have a security update, they send it to you, which I think is a better idea than holding the kernel back. But all in all, Linux Mint, I mean, there are people out there I know watching this video who absolutely love it. They love the Cinnamon desktop. They love the XFCE Mint experience or the Mate Mint experience. It's all great, man. Linux Mint is awesome. And if it works for you, great distribution. It's just that even though I love Linux Mint and I did run it as my main distribution for a long time, the technology's moving fast, and the Linux Mint folks in some ways are digging in their heels. They're trying to avoid moving on to new technologies, and I don't dig that, because it's getting better and better. It's moving quickly. So we'll see what they do with Mint 18. We shall see. I mean, it's one of the things that Linux Mint, well, I mean, that's enough about Linux Mint. I love it, and it's good for certain people. It's not my distro of choice these days for a number of reasons. Let's just, leave it there. Here's a distribution of Linux that I like an awful lot, and I have 2 or 3 people in the Linux Lite or the Linux Easy Linux community who are using it. I'd get it straight sooner or later. And this is Linux Lite. Linux Lite is based on Ubuntu. So is Linux Mint, by the way. Linux Mint is less based on Ubuntu than it is developed alongside Ubuntu and uses a big chunk of the Ubuntu base. But to say Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu is kind of like, makes it sound like that they just slapped a desktop on top of Ubuntu, and they didn't. So, I mean, there are the Linux Mint repositories. A lot of development goes on in the Mint project. Anyway, back to Linux Lite. Linux Lite is a distribution of Linux that is designed from the ground up to run on really, really, really low-end hardware. So if you have a 10 to 15-year-old machine, now we're talking about maybe Pentium 4 here, this thing will run on it. And my brother, for instance, has this old Dell machine that at this point is probably about 12 years old, and it's got 512 megabytes of RAM. This thing was designed for Windows XP, and he runs this on it, and it works, and it does pretty much everything he needs to do. It's an amazing distribution, and they offer some very nice tools. They have light software in there to help you get started, to help you install some other software. There's some problems with light software, kind of the way they implement it. I don't particularly like. What they do is they pretty much install all of the PPAs and everything for every link that's in light software when you spin up the distribution. So this caused problems when the Google folks decided to drop 32-bit Chrome support, because in the 64-bit versions of it caused the 64-bit versions of the operating system, it caused the light software updater to just stop working. And so I'm not a big fan of that idea. I like the concept, though, that people can just click and install things, but I really don't like having repositories hooked up to a system that the end user may or may not use. Of course, if you know what you're doing, you can go in there and just take those out and go, well, I'll never use that, so it's no big deal. But once again, we're looking from the perspective of new users and people who are not computer savvy. They just want it to work. But anyway, Linux Lite does have a few issues that they're working through, and they're really nice guys. But just for a basic distribution to get running on some really old hardware, this thing will do it for you. And conversely, you can take Linux Lite and you can put it on a modern machine, and then that machine is going to be really, really fast and really, really stable because it has such low overhead. So if that's something that appeals to you, definitely take a look at Linux Lite. And this is a distribution that we do support here through Easy Linux, and so is Linux Mint and Ubuntu Gnome. I'll work with you regardless of which one you want. You don't have to listen to my opinion. So let's see here. Of course, this is Ubuntu Mate, which I said at the beginning of the video, I think it's the best distribution of Linux ever. And we've looked at all these other distributions. You've heard what I've had to say. What Martin Wimpress and the Linux Mint, not Linux Mint, the Ubuntu Mate team have done is they have taken the really solid part of Ubuntu, which is the Ubuntu base, all that good technology that's going on under the desktop. They have taken the Mate desktop, which is very stable and very lightweight, and a great deal of work has been done on this desktop to make it modern, even though it looks like GNOME 2. Really, the Mate desktop and GNOME 2 don't have a lot in common anymore. There's a lot of the code that's changed. This is GTK3 and Qt ready. This thing will work with pretty much any program that you throw at it, and it renders all of these different programs nicely. In Ubuntu Gnome, I was very upset because VLC came up with really tiny print, even though I had turned the font, up a little bit. That's something you're not going to run into in Ubuntu Mate. The out-of-the-box experience for the user is the best I've ever seen. Just how it works, how it looks, and there are so many different tools that make this easy for even complete Linux newbies to set this up. If you go to this lovely welcome screen and you just start clicking around, you click on getting started, they take you through the process. And I have done this in video after video after video. This is an amazing tool. This is an amazing thing to have around. As a matter of fact, when I was playing around with other distributions of Ubuntu, I installed this so that I could use this to set up those systems. And I will probably continue to do that. If I should happen to want to, start do Ubuntu with Unity desktop on it, then I'm probably going to go ahead and install this piece of software just to make it easy. So watch my past videos on Ubuntu Mate for my opinion. And also, like I said, I've gotten at least 5 people started on Ubuntu Mate through Easy Linux back when it was still in beta, and every one of them has been really impressed. And these little problems that people are coming up with in Ubuntu 16.04, it seems that even though the release has started out a little bit shaky, the Ubuntu Mate team has really smoothed out those rough edges, and people who are running it are not having that kind of a problem. So this is why I say Ubuntu Mate. And I think that Martin Wimpress is one of the few people in the Linux community who starts with the user experience and works back, just like Steve Jobs said. And Ubuntu Mate was originally developed to keep his family happy. Something for his wife to run and his kids and his cousins or whoever else that he was doing personal home IT for, because they didn't like the GNOME 3 experience when that came along. And so, therefore, it is totally written from the user experience back. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's a lot of brouhaha going on in the Linux world right now about Ubuntu Mate, is because it is doing something that a lot of these other distributions have not done, and that is to really go, no, wait a minute, we got this technology, and this is what people want to do, so how do we make the technology do what people want to do? Whereas it seems to me that a lot of other distributions go, we've got really great technology, you're going to do what we tell you you can do with it in a lot of ways. All at the same time saying that it's simple and free, but yet it's not. You see what I'm saying? It's very George Orwellian. It's like, war is peace and love is hate and freedom is slavery, that sort of thing. So anyway, that is one of the reasons that I just absolutely love Ubuntu Mate, is that user experience comes first. And they're getting donations from me and all the support that I can give them, because I think that's the direction that Linux needs to go. Because if you really believe in the open source idea of this being available for everyone, then you need to take that a step further and say, okay, then we need to make this usable by everyone, and not have the Linux elitists run the show and say, no, we're going to make sure that we make this just a little bit difficult so only people with a high enough IQ to be in our little club can run it. That is the exact opposite of how Ubuntu Mate has been coded. And even if you are a very advanced Linux user, Ubuntu Mate is a wonderful thing to work with. And a lot of my opinions end up on freedompenguin.com. This is an article that I wrote about my short-lived little affair with the Manjaro project. And I went ahead and wrote it up, and I was very honest about my opinions here, and I'm trying to be honest in this video. Manjaro is a great idea. Take Arch Linux, which is all cutting edge, and then let us take that, and now we are going to make it easy, and we're going to give you a graphical installer, and we're going to install pretty much everything you need when it boots up. It's a great idea, and I wish them the best of luck. The only problem is that not only did it not work for me, but the moment that I started talking about Manjaro seriously here on the YouTube channel, the comments came flooding in from people who had similar experiences. They couldn't get it installed. Once they did get it installed, they ran updates and it broke the machine. They followed all the directions. They went to the wiki. They did everything. It wouldn't work. Blah 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 blah. I was inundated with these comments about it, and so therefore, I just said I'm trying to be honest about it. and say this is not the distribution for me, and it's certainly not a distribution that I'm going to be offering to Easy Linux clients, because things need to work. If you are going to advertise that your distribution is simple and easy to use, then it needs to be simple and easy to use. It needs to work. It's that simple. Not that I think that the Manjaro folks are in any way trying to pull a fast one on people. I think that they have a wonderful idea. I just think that there's more work that needs to be done. And honestly, that Arch base, it moves so quickly. Arch Linux is very different. I mean, if you have a new piece of software, it just goes into Arch. And having the latest software is great, but you also get all the latest bugs. And so therefore the Manjaro team has quite the job. They have to monitor what is happening in Arch Linux before they move it into the Manjaro repositories. And they can't test, the 30,000 packages that are in there, each one. So you never know. My hat's off to them, and I wish them the best of luck. Maybe at some point they can take that Arch-based technology and really make it user-friendly. But nobody's been able to do that quite yet. You really have to be on your toes if you're going to run any kind of Arch Linux. It just seems to be the way it is. And for those who need the latest and greatest and the absolute right now, as far as the technology is concerned, Arch is the answer. For anybody who really enjoys sitting down and taking 2 hours and putting their, building a Linux distribution one command at a time, great. That's wonderful. I had a good time playing with Arch. I could never get the desktop to work last night, but I did get it installed, and it, I created my user, and I was kind of happy with my little command line world. And then I got late, and I got tired, and I was like, oh, I think I might do the desktop tomorrow. No, I'll go ahead and do it now. And I missed a step and kind of messed it up, but it was still fun. So anyway, gang, that is my video about different distributions and my opinions, and I come back around to saying that as far as the Easy Linux clients are concerned, if somebody asks me, they say, what distribution of Linux should I start out with as of right now, as of this date, which is Friday, April the 29th, 2016, I think that the best Linux out there for new and intermediate users and people who just want a really great experience with a Linux desktop, the best that it can be right now, Ubuntu Gnome is definitely the best Linux distribution out there. Thank you for listening to my ramble. And I guess probably about a year or two here, we'll do another one of these videos. And as the technology moves along, but, I was going to do this really concise little presentation, but I'm not going to do it. I don't need to be politically correct about this. I can say whatever I want to, and I can take my time saying it. And that's the beauty about the Linux community. We can all have an opinion, and we can all do our own thing, and the only thing I ask is that if you disagree with something I've said in this video, that you post your comment and make it, be respectful. That's it. Most people are these days. I think the trolls have finally gotten the word that they're not going to be tolerated, because a lot of people in this community have come to the consensus that we're not going to tolerate it. We're going to ignore it. And it seems to be working. So anyway, gang, do check out Easy Linux on the web. Check out Easy Linux on Facebook. And check out freedompenguin.com for articles from contributors like myself. Lots of great things to read about what's going on in the world of Linux, and most of what you're going to read is designed to be for those of us who use Linux every day, at home and at work, on our desktops. We'll do it again soon.